Mr. Speaker, sir, it's a pleasure, as always, to be returning to debate European policy matters and to see the familiar cast of colleagues in all sides of the House. I beg to move the words on the order paper standing in the name of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. I want to start, Mr. Speaker, by making it clear that the government's political objectives remain to leave the European Union in accordance with the referendum decision of 2016, to do so in an orderly fashion that protects jobs, living standards and investment in this country, to do so by means of a formal withdrawal agreement under Article 50, which includes clear protections for European Union citizens living in the United Kingdom and United Kingdom citizens in the 27 other EU countries, which provides for a financial settlement and which ensures that there is no hard border on the island of Ireland. And we look forward to negotiating a deep and special partnership on trade, security and political cooperation with the European Union, a community of democracies which will remain not only our closest geographical neighbours, but key partners, friends and allies in the world. Give way to my honourable friend, Mr. Stone.
To my right honourable friend, with whom I've been debating these matters for the best part of 30 years. I want to ask him, in relation to this issue of community of democracies, how he can justify Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement, which would subjugate the United Kingdom and require us to pass primary legislation to achieve that objective, when the decisions which will be imposed on the citizens of every single member in this House, by virtue of what goes on in the Council of Ministers, will be decided by 27 other member states. We won't even be at the table, and without even so much as a transcript. Is it not a complete travesty of democracy?
No, I mean, as my honourable friend says, he and I have been debating European matters for about 30 years. Time does fly when one is enjoying oneself. The point I make to him is this, that I think his criticisms would have force if they were describing a situation which was intended to be permanent. All that is covered in that article of the withdrawal agreement to which he is referring are the arrangements that are necessary to govern the winding down of this country's membership of the European Union and the residual obligations that derive from that over a period of months and years. Give way to my honourable friend, member for Dover first, please.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. There have been a number of statements made by a number of different ministers in recent days that have left me somewhat puzzled as to, first of all, what the policy of Her Majesty's Government is, and also what the policy of Her Majesty's Government is in relation to collective responsibility. Would it be able to provide some clarification to assist the House?
The policy of the Government is what the Prime Minister set out in a statement yesterday and summarised in the words I have just spoken. The approach to collective responsibility is set out clearly in the Ministerial Code. I'll give way to my right honourable friend and then to the right honourable member for Birkenhead.
On a more positive note, in order to get this withdrawal agreement through, which we should all want to do, doesn't my right honourable friend agree that it's not necessary to unpick the withdrawal agreement? We could, under international law, have a conditional interpretative declaration stating the backstop is not permanent. And then if we get that, and if the Attorney-General changes his mind, will my honourable friend join me in urging all my Brexiteer colleagues to vote for this agreement, because the choice is no longer, perhaps, between an imperfect deal and no deal, it's between an imperfect deal and no Brexit.
Well said. Quite right. I agree very much with what my honourable friend has said, and I think we would all wish my right honourable and learned friend, the Attorney-General, well in the talks that he is continuing with representatives of the European Commission. Give way to the right honourable gentleman. And then
Immensely grateful to the Secretary of State giving away. Is he aware that the atmosphere in this debate is changing from one which is massively concerned about crashing out and the damage that might do, to those of us who want to leave worrying about we will get no Brexit at all? And therefore might I, through him, address the grouping that normally sits behind him in that direction, that the choice that we will face when the Prime Minister's motion comes back is whether we have the certainty of some deal, or, as his right and learned friend said, no deal at all.
I think that the right honourable gentleman does encapsulate in his remarks very accurately the decision that faces every honourable member of this House, whichever political party or grouping they come from. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman, then to the honourable lady.
For giving way. This may help us later on in the debate. I'm just wondering if the Deputy Prime Minister could give some clarity on whether, in fact, the Government are going to be supporting Amendment B later on in relation to the amendment tabled by the member for South Leicestershire, because as I understand it, he has been sacked for putting this forward, but in fact it was something the Home Secretary was supporting. So I'm confused. Could he set out where the Government stand on this issue?
It may not be the first or last time the right honourable gentleman has been confused, but I think he will have to contain his excitement till I can, if I get through a number of interventions, Mr. Speaker, make progress to deal with the amendments that have been tabled. I guess, if the honourable forgive me, I had indicated I was going to give way to the right honourable member, the chair of the Select Committee. Then I will come to her.
Very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Following the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, can he just clarify something? If the Prime Minister's deal, when it returns to the House, is defeated, and leaving with no deal is also defeated by the House, will the motion that will be brought on the 14th of March, proposing an extension to Article 50 and setting out the proposed time period, will that time period be capable of amendment by the House?
Yeah.
Whether a motion is capable of amendment and which amendments are in order is, of course, always a matter for the Chair, rather than for ministers. But I would point out to the right honourable gentleman that, in addition to the opportunities for amendment that would arise on such a motion in the normal course of events, and I can't predict at this moment how the Chair will rule, that the obligations on the Government in the circumstances he's described in respect of Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act will also remain. I give way to the honourable lady from North Down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am very grateful indeed to the Minister. The Minister will, of course, be well aware that we are approaching the 21st anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement on the 10th of April, just days after we are due to Brexit. So I have assumed, and I want the Minister to confirm this, that in light of the Government's repeated emphasis on its commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement throughout the Brexit negotiations, and quite rightly so, that the Government has been busy organising, planning a significant event to mark its commitment to the Belfast Agreement. Would the Minister just shed some light on that particular anniversary event?
I think that the detail of any events to mark that anniversary would be a matter for my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, to announce. But what I can say to the honourable lady is this: that the Government, and certainly I personally, would regard the achievement of the Belfast Agreement and the development of the peacemaking and peace-building process in Northern Ireland as one of the most signal political achievements of successive governments of different political parties in this country during my career in this House. I can remember being called to meeting with other government backbenchers in John Major's office when he first reported on the message that he had received from the back channels to Sinn Féin IRA about the prospects of a process opening up. And I know how much he, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron and my right honourable friend, the present Prime Minister, have committed themselves to that process, and that is something, that commitment is something which I believe every honourable member of this House will share. I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman from the SNP and the honourable gentleman, and then I am going to make some progress.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Would he agree with me that the phrase government policy implies not just the offering of a choice to the House, but the expression by the government of a preference as to the outcome of that choice? And if he does agree with that, will he say today, to inform the debate, what the government's policy will be on either voting for a no-deal Brexit or extending Article 50?
The honourable gentleman is asking me to speculate about hypothetical events where my energies and the government's energies are focused is on achieving a negotiated agreement with the European Union behind which a majority of right honourable and honourable members in this House are prepared to rally. Give way to the honourable gentleman, then I'll move on.
I thank the Secretary for giving way. In relation to the point you just answered from the Chair of the Select Committee, the Prime Minister was very, very clear in what she said yesterday. She said that if the House voted for an extension, that she would bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date commensurate with that extension. Could you just provide some more clarity on that? Is he talking about, for example, bringing in a statutory instrument immediately after such a vote to make that happen, or some other sort of way of changing the date in the bill? It would be very helpful to have some clarity on that point.
Well, I will come to that point perhaps when I address the amendments in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Meriden. I'll give way to the Chairman of the Select Committee and then I will make some progress.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Would he agree with me, further to the point made by the honourable lady, the member for North Down, that a good way to commemorate the signing of the Good Friday Agreement would be to encourage the European Union to define what it meant by temporary, as listed in Article 1, Clause 4 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, since without some certainty on that, it's difficult to see how the withdrawal agreement is compatible with the Good Friday Agreement.
That this question about the definition of temporary is an important one, particularly in the light of the position that the European Union has consistently taken in negotiations with us over the last 2 years, that a withdrawal agreement negotiated under the terms of Article 50 cannot be a secure legal basis for the creation of a permanent partnership with a third country. Now, Mr. Speaker, if the House will forgive me, I think I have given way quite a lot and I do want to move on to the substance of my speech. At the end of the debate this afternoon, this House will have a choice in respect of the government motion and the various amendments which you have selected, but by the 12th of March at the latest, it will have a more important choice when we bring back a second meaningful vote. And there's been a lot of speculation. Already we've heard that in the debate this afternoon about what should happen if the House declined then to vote for a deal. Let me start by saying why I am confident that the Prime Minister will be able to put before the House a deal that it can support, and why this House should support such a deal. My right honourable friend spoke yesterday of the extensive work that has been taking place to make good on the call from this House for legal changes to guarantee that the Northern Ireland backstop cannot endure indefinitely. And since the 29th of January, when this House endorsed an amendment tabled by my right honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale West, my right honourable friends, the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, the Attorney General and I have been engaging in focused discussions with the EU, with the different institutions of the Union and with Member State governments to find a way forward that would work for both sides. And we are making good progress in that work with constructive discussions taking place this week. Honourable members will also have heard that there have been discussions too on the political declaration, including additions or changes that increase the focus and ambition of both sides to deliver the future partnership we both seek as soon as possible. And the ideas that we are putting forward in these discussions are not simply the government's. They reflect the intensive dialogue we've had with members from across this House, including the conversations we've had with honourable members from other political parties, and I myself have met the Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras once, keen to do so again, as he knows, as well as meeting colleagues in other political parties and representative of all different shades of opinion on this country's relationship with the European Union. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
My right honourable friend, he really has been very generous. Just before he moves on for the question of alternative arrangements, he and his colleague, the right honourable member, who's the Brexit Secretary, are to be strongly congratulated for getting the European Union to accept the need to set up a task force of experienced officials on the European side and the UK side to work up the arrangement proposed by our working group. Could he guarantee that those proposals, once accepted, there will be a commitment in the agreement, in the treaty, that will be legally binding and will commit the government and the European Union to a definite and definitive date by which they will be implemented?
Mr. Speaker, I mean, my right honourable friend from Oswestry has championed this approach for a long time now, and I'm grateful to him and to other colleagues on this side of the House for the detailed discussions that have taken place with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and others about alternative arrangements to ensure the absence of a hard border in Northern Ireland. Let's not forget that this term, alternative arrangements, features in both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. They are already known concepts in the documents that have previously been agreed. So this has led, I'm trying to reply to my right honourable friend. This has led to the consideration of a joint work stream with the European Union that will take place during the next phase of our negotiations. Our objective is to ensure that we have a set of alternative arrangements that can be used even in the absence of a full future relationship deal at the end of the implementation period. And the EU has agreed to prioritise what will be an important work stream in the next phase. But we will also be setting up here domestic structures to take advice from external experts, from businesses who trade with the European Union and beyond, and from colleagues across this House. This will be supported by civil service resources and £20 million of government funding. Give way to the honourable lady.
For giving way. He mentions the hard border and the backstop. Does he understand why the Irish government last week produced a legal bill going through Parliament to deal with any problem to do with the WTO if we happen to go out on WTO terms? And yet there was no mention whatsoever of any infrastructure, any hard border. How come the Irish government can do that and at the same time we're saying that the hard border is such a huge, big issue?
It is for the Irish government to explain their policy. What we also have to, and I'm assuming they will have to deal with also, is the reality of the plans that the European Union Commission published in December last year, in which they stated very plainly that from the day the United Kingdom departs the EU, that in the absence of a transitional period, as provided for under the withdrawal agreement, from day one, the full EU acquis in terms of tariffs and regulatory checks and inspections would have to be applied. And one of the things that was striking about that Commission publication was it made no specific reference or provided no exemption for the situation in Ireland. Now, that is something for the Government of Ireland to take up with the European Commission, but that is part of the legal and political reality with which governments are also dealing. I give way to the honourable lady.
Well, to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He's being very generous with his interventions. I wonder if I can just pursue the question that was asked by the honourable gentleman for North Shropshire. Would I be correct in understanding that these discussions that are going on about the backstop relate purely to the next phase of the negotiations and what can be done in relation to the political declaration, and do not involve any question of opening up the withdrawal agreement and changing the force of the withdrawal agreement? That's what it is, isn't it? If you look at the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, it was all about the next phase. A work stream in the next phase is the phrase that the honourable gentleman just used. Can he clarify that? It's not about opening up the withdrawal agreement.
With the honourable lady that when the Attorney General has been talking to representatives of the European Commission this week, when my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has been talking to representatives of the European Commission. They have been talking about changes to the overall terms of the agreement to facilitate our orderly departure from the European Union. And I'll give way to the right honourable lady and then to the honourable gentleman, then I will move on.
No, the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'd like to thank him for what he did yesterday with the publication of the summary of the no-deal papers, if I put it in that way. But my question to him is this: why are we, or rather, why is the government only now, after 2.5 years, looking at these alternative arrangements, when in any event the Northern Ireland Select Committee did an enormous amount of work at finding some alternatives? They travelled the world and they came to the conclusion that there are no alternatives some considerable time ago.
The right honourable lady. First of all, can I thank the right honourable lady for what she said in respect of the papers we published yesterday. I thought she was being uncharacteristically unfair to the government in her criticisms about not dealing with this earlier. I think that the truth is that a lot of both official and ministerial time was spent over the last 18 months in examining some of these. One of the problems that was identified, and which still confronts us today, and which we are talking to the European Commission about in the context of these discussions about alternative arrangements, is that we have to deal not only with the problem of the technology itself and making sure that there is technology that is fit for purpose, but we would also, on the sort of model that has been discussed, need to see quite a significant number of derogations by the EU from its normal arrangements. And so there are legal and not just technical problems that would have to be overcome. Give way to the honourable gentleman, then I'm going to make progress.
Would the honourable member agree that because the political declaration is legally non-binding, any concessions he gives on the level of alignment to the single market, the customs union standards, the environment, are intrinsically changeable in the future, and that the only safeguard in place to stop a sort of slash and burn approach to a future Tory government is the backstop itself?
I place rather more faith in this House than the honourable gentleman would appear to do, because I don't think that there is any appetite in Parliament for what he described as a slash-and-burn approach to standards. Now, Mr. Speaker, we believe that our deal is the right one for this country, and there is no better deal that is available on the table. I also believe, the government believes, that leaving with our deal is better than leaving without a deal. I'll give way to my honourable friend, since he tried valiantly to persuade you, Mr. Speaker, to accept an amendment that was unsuccessful. I'll let him in now.
First of all, I hope my right honourable friend will agree that Amendment J, which unfortunately wasn't tabled, but I'm sure the government will have no problem with Amendment and accepting Amendment J, at least in principle, and I look forward to hearing about that. But can I just put this to my right honourable friend? For many of us who have wished the Prime Minister well, we recognise that compromise is required on both sides in these negotiations. The transition period isn't brilliant, but the backstop does have to be sorted out with regard to its indefinite nature. In recognising that, does my right honourable friend, is he at all concerned that the next steps, as outlined by the Prime Minister yesterday, just perhaps might make a good deal less likely, because the EU may hope that Parliament does its work for it by taking no deal off the table and extending Article 50?
Yeah, exactly.
I genuinely don't fear that, because what I'm finding increasingly in my conversations with politicians in different parts of Europe is that they want this issue sorted out. Frankly, they have got politics of their own. They have got important decisions on a whole range of subjects, from the future of the Eurozone to the negotiation of a multi-annual financial framework without a United Kingdom contribution, to the tensions that exist between some of the Central European and Western European powers within the European Union, to the continuing problem of very large-scale movement of people from Africa into southern Europe. And it would be a mistake for honourable members to think that the leaders of the other 27 countries spend every waking hour thinking and worrying about Brexit matters. I'll give way to the right honourable member for old time's sake, then I'll come back to the honourable member for Healand Yard, then the honourable lady, then
I'm extremely grateful to the Secretary of State. He's been very, and if I may say so, typically generous in giving way to members from all sides of the House. He was just referring to the position of other member states. Yesterday, the Prime Minister told us for the first time that she would countenance an extension to the Article 50 period. But today, President Macron of France is quoted as saying, "We would agree to an Article 50 extension only if it is justified by a new choice of the British. In no way would we accept an extension without a clear objective." Isn't it the case that if there is to be an extension, it must be an extension with a purpose, rather than for 2 or 3 months of the same parliamentary gridlock?
No, I agree with the right honourable gentleman, and I don't think what he's just said is any different from what the Prime Minister or other ministers have been saying at this dispatch box for several months now. Give way to the honourable member.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker Staplew. Unfortunately, of course, my Amendment G to end the whole charade of revoking Article 50 is not accepted at all. We've got a series of Brexit-enabling amendments down today. But I want to take the Minister back to one point on the concessions you're looking for the European Union and borders. So we know the technology is not invented, but the idea is we have derogations, so there are concessions. Now, if the European Union is going to be giving concessions for that on that border, it's going to have to give them on every border, and the European Union owns multiple borders. Yeah. So why wouldn't the European Union be doing this already? The reason they're not is because we're back to UK pie-in-the-sky fantasy thinking, and I hope he accepts that.
I think the flaw in the honourable gentleman's logic was this, that it should be something that would be welcome to any government or any supranational authority like the European Commission if technology and systems are available which streamline border processes, whether we were talking about the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland or the border across the short straits or other external borders of the European Union with third countries. I'll give way to Honourable Lady of Totnes.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. I'm glad that the Government has published at least the summary of the no-deal consequences and hope that they will go much further and publish the detail. But can I ask the Secretary of State, has he also seen this week in The Lancet the detailed paper that's been published about the health consequences of no deal? And will he assure me that if he hasn't seen it, that he will look in detail at those consequences? Because I believe no responsible government could inflict that kind of pain on its people.
Well said. Absolutely.
I haven't seen that particular paper. I will make sure I look at it and draw it to the attention of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health. But I would say, I hope by way of some reassurance to the honourable lady, is that the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care has been making these preparations one of his very top priorities. He wrote to the leaders of the healthcare and pharmaceutical sectors in December last year, and the NHS executive is working very hard on making sure that contingency arrangements are in place to ensure that the supplies of medicines continue to be available. Yes, I haven't given way to the Honourable Lady before, so I will.
I am very grateful to him for giving way, and I wanted to just be a little bit helpful, because in his response to the honourable member on the benches next to me, he basically said that he didn't see any difference between what President Macron was saying and what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday. There is a huge difference. What the Prime Minister was saying yesterday was that she would use any extension for more dither, delay, faffing, kicking the can down the road. What President Macron is saying is that there has to be a purpose, and that the purpose that is
gaining more and more credibility across the House is precisely to put this to a public vote.
First of all, I think that the honourable lady does not characterise the Prime Minister's words yesterday accurately at all. And the Prime Minister could not have been clearer in many appearances at this dispatch box that in every conversation we've had with the European Commission or heads of member state governments, they have said that were we to at any stage seek an extension of Article 50, they would want to understand for how long that was being sought and the purpose for which that was being sought. So I don't think that anything that President Macron said today comes as a shock to us. Now, if the Honourable Member will forgive me, I'll try and give way to him later, but if he will let me move on for the moment. I said, Mr. Speaker, that the government believes that leaving with our deal is better than leaving without a deal. And honourable members who have seen the summary paper published yesterday will know that, and from other sources too, that there is no avoiding the fact that an abrupt departure from the European Union without an agreement of any kind would lead to a shock to our economy, and that it would not be possible for a government, even with the most meticulous planning of arrangements in this country, to mitigate and plan entirely for what might be happening out with our own jurisdiction, and we will be reliant in those circumstances, for example, on the readiness of the authorities in France and elsewhere to introduce streamlined checks and procedures, or the readiness of the European Commission to allow a derogation short-term from its normal rules and practices. As a responsible government, we've therefore been taking appropriate steps to minimise that disruption and have published extensive information to ensure the country is prepared. We've published and updated 106 technical notices and contacted the 145,000 businesses who trade with the European Union to help them prepare for no-deal customs procedures. And it is, Mr. Speaker, a fact that as long as this House is unable to agree to an alternative course of action and get behind a particular agreement on exit from the European Union, then businesses and individuals will have to plan for and take action as well. And the government has taken and will continue to take steps to provide businesses and citizens with advice to help them make preparations to mitigate the potential impacts of a no-deal Brexit. And the paper yesterday showed that there's more action businesses should consider taking, and which the government urges them to plan for as necessary. I give way to my honourable friend and then to what they did. Now I'm moving on.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I think the whole House appreciates his generosity over this. As the honourable gentleman knows, the meaningful vote needs to return to this House by the 12th of March. If that vote falls, we then, the following day, presumably, move on to whether or not we rule out no deal. Could I ask the right honourable gentleman whether he and other members of the government will vote in favour or against that?
I mean, the one thing I have learned, I don't blame my honourable friend for having a good try, but one thing I have learned in my years here, and perhaps been reinforced by observing events in recent weeks, is that I may want at some stage to give advice to my right honourable friends, the Chief Whip and the Prime Minister, about whipping for any actual or hypothetical motion, but I'm not going to do it from the dispatch box, but do it in private instead. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. I'm sure my honourable friend will be aware that a lot of small businesses have not put in place the preparations, and many of them may have been misled or under the impression by comments made in this House that tariff-free trade may be available for 10 years under the GATT 24 provisions. The document published by the government makes that crystal clear that those provisions are not available, And can I encourage my honourable friend to make that clear so that small businesses in my constituency and around the country are not, do not rely on what they may think has been publicised as being an option when it isn't?
Makes a good point, as our right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, has publicly rebutted the arguments about Article 24 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the reference in the paper published yesterday was a reference to the Trade Secretary's remarks, and the government is stepping up its communications to business about this point. And we accept that in this country also, I believe in our major trading partners, such as France and Germany, it tends to be small and medium-sized enterprises who, for all the obvious reasons, don't have the capacity to spend a lot of time monitoring what governments are saying, and therefore may be further behind in their planning than the larger companies, and we will do our utmost to try to communicate with them better. Mr. Speaker, if I may, I beg the right honourable lady's pardon, I will give way to her, then I would like to come on and address the various amendments that have been selected.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. The reason that the question from the member for Dartford is so important is because businesses are already still worrying that they are having to move money, jobs and assets abroad because they don't know what is going on. And the Minister could give huge clarity to those businesses if the government simply said they will vote against no deal if it comes to a vote on March the 13th. And this is really important because we need to know the status of the commitments that were made by the Prime Minister yesterday, because the Brexit Secretary has previously dismissed motions passed by this House. He said that legislation, frankly, the legislation takes precedence over the motions and has referring to previous motions against no deal. And he has also said that the government's policy continued to be to leave with no deal on March the 29th if there wasn't a deal passed by this House. Could he now confirm that as a result of the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, that policy has now changed and the government policy is at least simply to be bound by the will of this House if no deal is passed by March the 13th, rather than simply to leave without a deal?
The short answer to the right honourable lady is yes. I will flesh this out when I respond in more detail to the amendments which have been selected, but the words that my right honourable friend the Prime Minister used yesterday were words that had been discussed and agreed at the Cabinet meeting yesterday morning. I would just say to her, in terms of her earlier question to me, that I do think she's leaping too lightly over the fact that it's the government's clear intention, before we get into any debates or motions about how we respond to a potential decision on exiting without a deal, that to bring forward to this House a motion on a revised deal and to invite the House to support that. I will be supporting the government when that vote is brought forward, just as I supported the government on the previous meaningful vote, and that decision will remain the earliest possible opportunity for this House to end the uncertainty that businesses and individuals now experience, as she rightly said. Now, if I can turn,
with great respect, I think the question being asked by my honourable friend Member for Dartford and the honourable lady is absolutely key to understanding what the Prime Minister said yesterday. I entirely understand that he's retreating, as the Prime Minister does, to the argument that the aim is to get a withdrawal agreement, and I support what he says on that. But if it doesn't get a majority, and it was defeated by 230 at the first attempt, the key thing to know is whether the government will actually vote in favour of an extension, or whether the government is going to vote in favour of leaving with no deal. And the Cabinet must have considered that when they sorted out their differences in, no doubt, a perfectly private, orderly and good-humoured meeting yesterday.
My right honourable friend is asking me to comment on a hypothetical whipping decision, on a hypothetical vote, which it's the government's wish and intention we don't actually have to confront, because we will be voting as a House in favour of the revised deal, which will reflect elements that this House on the 29th of last month said that it wanted to see changed in order to be able to support the withdrawal agreement wholeheartedly. And exactly the same challenge that my right honourable friend has posed is what would be posed in respect of any hypothetical event on the bill that was proposed by the right honourable lady, the member for Pontefract and Castleford. And I think at this stage it is too early to make those assertions on a hypothetical. What we are focused on, where our energies are in government, is on negotiating an agreement with our partners in the European Union, which delivers on the conditions which this House set when it passed the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale West. I will give way one last time to the honourable friend, the member for Yeovil, then I am going to make some progress. I'm never going to get on these amendments.
Very, very grateful to my right honourable friend. Just before he moves on, I just would like to ask one question about the no-deal advice paper. When was it prepared, and why didn't it mention the use of the transit system, which actually can mean that goods are delivered well into Europe and don't have to be stopped and checked at Calais?
The instructions were given to draft that paper following the debate last week, during which the right honourable lady, the member for Broxtowe, agreed to withdraw the amendment in her name calling for the publication of cabinet papers, following an assurance given from the dispatch box by my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary at the Department for Exiting the European Union. I spoke then to the right honourable lady to ascertain the information that she wanted, and what we have produced is a document which I believe is thorough, which I am satisfied can be traced in all details to documents that have gone before Cabinet or Cabinet committees. And internally, I've been able to footnote every assertion made in that paper. But we took the words of the right honourable lady's amendment in seeking material that had been given to Cabinet and Cabinet committees, and the content of the document was determined by that categorisation. Since I've referred to, I will give way to once more, and then I am going to make progress.
Gentlemen, as ever, Mr. Speaker is being very generous, but it is very important to make it clear. I just took a sample of the many papers from which this document has been compiled, and I can assure the House that from my reading of the contents of those papers, this was an accurate and fair summary. And the other thing is, Mr. Speaker, is that the original document that I was given was then edited because it was updated. That's how up-to-date it was, and I'm confident about that. I now want the detail, but that's another matter.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable lady. If I can now move on to the various amendments that have been tabled, and if I can move straight to Amendment F in the name of the right honourable lady, member for Pontefract and Castleford, my right honourable friends, the members for West Dorset and Meriden, and
the right honourable gentleman starts on this important process of critical analysis to which we all look forward with eager anticipation. I simply point out to him, as I'm sure he's aware, that he's currently on 44 minutes. A snip, I know, but 44 minutes. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will try and restrain my appetite to give way to interventions further. Yesterday, the Prime Minister set out 3 clear commitments to the House that should provide reassurance and clarity about the way forward. First, we will hold a second meaningful vote by Tuesday, the 12th of March at the latest. Secondly, if the government have not brought forward a further meaningful vote, or if we have lost such a second meaningful vote by Tuesday the 12th of March, then we will, in addition, and I stress this is in addition, not in place of, the government's obligations to table a neutral amendable motion under Section 13 of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, table a motion to be voted on by Wednesday the 13th of March at the latest, asking this House if it supports leaving the European Union without a withdrawal agreement and a framework for a future relationship on the 29th of March this year. So the United Kingdom will only leave without a deal on the 29th of March if there is explicit consent in this House for that outcome. Third, if this House, having rejected leaving with the deal negotiated with the EU, then also rejects leaving on the 29th of March without a withdrawal agreement and future framework, the government will, on the 14th of March, bring forward a motion on whether Parliament wants to seek a short, limited extension to Article 50, and if the House votes for an extension, seek to agree that extension approved by the House with the European Union, and bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date commensurate with that extension. So the government is committing itself to bring forward, and therefore clearly to support, such legislation. These commitments all fit the timescale set out in the private member's bill in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford. They are commitments made by the Prime Minister, and the government will stick by them, as we have previous commitments to make statements and table amendable motions by specific dates. Now, for yes, I'll give them.
To my right honourable friend, may I say to him first of all that I enormously welcome the fact that he's reiterated all of that from the dispatch box. I personally have had no cause ever to doubt that what the Prime Minister states from the dispatch box will be anything other than fully fulfilled, but his repeating it today is helpful, as indeed the remarks of my right honourable friend, the Brexit Secretary, earlier in the morning were helpful. And it's my view that in the light of those remarks, there is not a necessity to proceed in the way that the Right Honourable Member for Normanton and I would have wished, with many others, to proceed in relation to Amendment C and the bill that came under it.
Yeah. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I'll give way to the right honourable lady.
If the government brings forward legislation in accordance with a vote in Parliament, would the government presumably still be voting for that legislation? And also, can he explain what the circumstances would be if there was a disagreement about either the length or terms of the extension between the government and the EU? In those circumstances, will the government bring it back to Parliament for a further vote, rather than simply dismissing it and deciding to shift to no deal instead?
Well, as the right honourable lady knows, the Prime Minister said that it would be short and limited extension. Clearly, it is a fact of law that there would have to be agreement with all of the other 27 governments for any extension to the Article 50 period to be agreed. That's just reflecting the treaties. It seems to me it just logically follows that if the government is committing itself, Prime Minister's committed us as a government to bring forward legislation in these circumstances to comply with what would have been the will of the House. Therefore, the government would be supporting such legislation if it brought it forward. The honourable lady want to get in for quite a long time, so.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Well, with the greatest respect, he didn't ask the other question my honourable friend asked, which is if the EU does not want to agree to a short, time-limited extension, what will the government do then? Will they come back to the House with a different proposal. This is a serious, honourable gentlemen shake their heads there. But we need to know, because if the EU turns that down, then what happens? Do we crash out with no deal? Or do we have another chance to ask for perhaps a longer extension?
In the absence of either an agreement to extend, or to leave with a deal, or to revoke Article 50 altogether, the default legal position under the treaties is that once Article 50 has been triggered, the exit date is 2 years after. I mean, that is a matter of European law. The honourable lady, if I can just respond, the honourable lady was asking a perfectly serious question there. I do not believe that the other governments of the European Union have either an economic interest or a strategic interest in seeing a chaotic departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. So my belief is that there would be a negotiated agreement in those circumstances. But as I have said earlier, in the new obligation that the Prime Minister announced yesterday is in addition to the ones which in those circumstances would already flow as a result of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act, and that is Section 13 as modified by the two amendments successfully brought forward by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield. So the matter would come back to the House, and there will be an opportunity for right honourable and honourable members to put forward amendments to urge particular courses of action. I mean, Mr. Speaker, I'm conscious of the concern you expressed about time. I'm also conscious about the honourable friend from St Albans wanting to get into. Then I'll come to my honourable friend from Stamford.
Because I've listened very carefully to just about every debate on this topic, and I understand that the European Union would only give an extension if they thought there was a reasonableness behind the request. I can perfectly understand that. Can I ask, what would be the rationale that we would give to ask for this very short and limited extension, given that the House will have already rejected the newly negotiated deal? And I can't think that what else could happen in those couple of months that would be helpful.
Tempting though it is, my honourable friend is asking me to go deeper into the realms of hypothetical speculation. A lot would depend on where we had got to in the negotiations, the reasons for which the House in these hypothetical circumstances had rejected the revised agreement, and so let me give way to my honourable friend, the member for Stamford.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend, and nobody has a better understanding of these issues than him, and there is nobody whose word I would trust more completely at the dispatch box than him. But this is very, very important detail, and he, in his speech, referred to the fact that the Prime Minister yesterday had made commitments that replicated the provisions in the draft bill, the Cooper-Letwin bill, that we are hoping not to have to move as a result. Now, that bill very specifically set out what would happen if the government proposed an extension, having consulted with Parliament and received Parliament's approval, to the European Union, and the European Union had come back and said, we're not happy to grant that extension, but we suggest a different length of extension. The bill made provision to come back to the House with whatever had been negotiated with the European Union to seek the approval of the House for that actual extension. And it is extremely important that we have that same provision confirmed here today at the dispatch box, because if we do not, then I, for one, will feel bound to continue with the process of supporting the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend for Meriden, and then tomorrow supporting the bill. If we can have that reassurance from him that the House will get a chance to approve whatever final extension length is agreed between the Government and the European Union, if it is different than the one that the House has previously consented to, then I will be happy.
The straight answer, my old friend, is yes, of course. Frankly, I just do not see any circumstance in which, if there were a period that had been agreed with the European Union, this would always had the potential to be agreed, that the government would not bring this back to the House. Were the government not to bring it back, then it would be brought back anyway under the provisions of Section 13 in the way that I described in response to an earlier intervention. So I think I can give my honourable friend that very clear reassurance on that point.
I'm sorry. I think he will find it helpful. I have to say, I thought that answer was extraordinarily helpful, and I agree with him entirely. Actually, the provision already exists under Section 13, but his confirmation of the attitude of the government to that matter, I think, settles the thing.
To my right honourable friend, he's been trying to get in for a long time. Okay, one last.
Chancellor Judge of Lancaster is extremely generous, and I do take his word very seriously as well. He didn't quite answer my question earlier on, specifically about the legislation that the Prime Minister and he has repeated the commitment to bringing forward on the extension. What would be the form of that legislation, and would, for example, the date be able to be changed? How would disputes over that be dealt with, as my honourable friend, the Chair of the Committee, asked as well?
I don't think at this stage I can go into detail. The legislation depend a bit on what the outcome of the negotiations with the European Union itself had led to. If it were secondary legislation, then clearly there's the normal constraints on amendments. But equally, if it's secondary legislation, it's sudden death in both houses. That both houses have a veto over such secondary legislation. So the Section 13 provisions do give a safeguard to the House that there is always that additional opportunity to bring forward and vote on concerns that the House feels are being overlooked. If I can turn to Amendment C, and I'm grateful to my rightful friend, the member for West Dorset, for indicating that he thought that this would not now need to be pressed. I think that if the House will allow me, in the light of his comments, I would not propose to go into detail about Amendment C, but I'm perhaps happy if that is still brought up further during the debate. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, when he comes to wind up, can respond to those points. And I do want to refer to Amendment B in the name of my honourable friend, the member for South Leicestershire. Now, on citizens' rights, I think my honourable friend has succeeded in an endeavour that some might have thought was impossible, in persuading both the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, and my honourable friend, the member for North East Somerset, to share the honours as lead signatories to an amendment. And all members of this House are aware of how vocally and passionately my honourable friend has campaigned on this issue of citizens' rights for many months now. And this is an area the government takes extremely seriously. We have consistently put citizens' rights first in our negotiations. It was one of the very first areas, parts of the withdrawal agreement, to have been agreed and negotiations completed with the European Union. And of course, the best way to guarantee those rights, both for our citizens in the EU and EU citizens here, is to vote in favour of the deal, which of course my honourable friend did in January. But there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding no deal. That is why the government has already committed that the rights of the 3 million EU citizens living in the UK will be protected in any scenario. EU citizens resident here by the 29th of March would be able to apply to the EU settlement scheme to secure their status, and the Home Office has already granted more than 100,000 applications under that scheme, and such people will continue to have access to social security and health care as before. Now, I know that also lying behind my honourable friend's amendment is concern about the rights of UK nationals living elsewhere in the EU. Now, in the absence of a deal, this would be a matter for the EU and its member states, and despite the welcome progress made by some member states, there are others where the offer to UK nationals, in our view, falls short, and access to health care is a particular concern. The government, led by the Foreign Secretary, is actively seeking solutions to address these issues through bilateral contacts with member state governments, as well at the same time as seeking a common EU-wide approach. We should not, though, underestimate the challenge in reaching a joint UK-EU commitment, as the amendment calls for, to ring-fence the agreement on citizens' rights. The European Union has been very consistent in saying to us that its legal mandate is clear, that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, and that if these issues were not addressed in the withdrawal agreement, their view is that there are significant legal problems for the EU in protecting these rights, since in those circumstances some of these issues would fall within the competence of member states and not of the EU institutions. Now, despite those challenges, we do share with my honourable friend the common goal of protecting the rights of citizens in the event of no deal. So, in view of the fact that our political objectives are the same, the government will accept the amendment today, and we will take up with the Commission, following this debate, assuming that the House endorses the amendment, the arguments that have been embodied in my honourable friend's amendment, to seek clarification of the EU position on ring-fencing the citizens' rights parts of the withdrawal agreement, and to see whether they can be persuaded to change the position that they have adopted hitherto. Mr. Speaker, I'm conscious that I am disappointing a number of honourable friends and other honourable members, but I think otherwise there's a danger that my speech and associated interventions are going to take up pretty well all the time available for debate today. If I can move to the Amendment K and then Amendment A. Amendment K, in the name of the leader of the Scottish National Party in Westminster, wills certain ends without any means. It asserts a determination not to leave the European Union without a withdrawal agreement and future framework under any circumstances and regardless of any exit date. It is therefore asserting a power to override what is actually in the European Union treaties that can have no effect in terms of European law and the implications of the Article 50 process. And while I understand the political motives behind Amendment K, I think the problem with that amendment is that it is just ignoring the legal reality that once Article 50 has been triggered, the only ways in which to avoid what the amendment seeks to avoid are to agree a deal or to revoke the Article 50 altogether and commit this country permanently, in good faith, to use the terms of the Court of Justice judgment, to membership of the European Union to the future. And for those reasons, the government cannot accept that. Now, I've also seen and studied the amendment tabled in the name of the Leader of the Opposition, and I would urge honourable members opposite to look at what my right honourable friend the Prime Minister said in her reply to the right honourable gentleman, because at each of the 5 points detailed in the opposition amendment, I believe the government's deal provides the right answer for the people of the United Kingdom. So let me briefly, Mr. Speaker, take each of those 5 points in turn. First, the amendment instructs ministers to seek a permanent...
Deputy Prime Minister has now been on his feet for over an hour. Is there anything that you could think of from the chair to extol him to perhaps reach his peroration in this respect?
Well, it is 63 minutes. The Minister of the Cabinet Office is known for the intellectual approach that he adopts, which includes analysis in copious detail of propositions advanced by other colleagues, but I feel sure he's nearing that peroration which is keenly anticipated. Minister.
I just say to the honourable member for Perth and North Perthshire that it's his honourable friends, as well as other colleagues across the House, who've been seeking to intervene. And if somebody intervenes on me, I think in justice they deserve a considered response to the point that they have made. Now, the Amendment A instructs ministers to seek a permanent customs union. but the political declaration already provides for the benefits of a customs union: no tariffs, quotas or checks on rules of origin. And at the same time, the political declaration says rather than try and seek a voice in EU trade deals, the UK should have an independent trade policy. And beyond the label of permanent customs union, it's not clear to me what outcomes the Labour amendment is seeking that the political declaration does not offer. Second, the amendment instructs ministers to seek close alignment with the single market, but the EU has already said that the deal provides for the closest relationship possible outside the single market. And frictionless trade in goods and agri-food is one of our key negotiating objectives. And the truth is, if one looks at the EU position, they have said completely frictionless trade is only possible if we stay in the single market, and that would mean accepting both free movement and EU state aid rules in full, things which the Labour Party's leadership has said it does not want to see, and that is why I assume their amendment is ambiguous about what a close relationship really means. Third, the amendment instructs ministers to seek dynamic alignment on rights. We are committed to ensuring that leaving the EU will not lead to any lowering of standards in relation to workers' rights. What we are prepared to do is to commit to giving Parliament a vote on whether it wishes to follow suit in the future whenever EU standards in areas such as workers' rights or health and safety are judged to have been strengthened. Fourth, the amendment instructs ministers to seek participation in EU agencies. The political declaration sets out how we aim to participate in EU programmes in a number of areas and have the closest possible relationship with EU agencies in the heavily regulated sectors. And fifth, the amendment instructs us to seek agreement on the detail of future security arrangements, including participation in specific EU tools and measures. And frankly, anybody who's listened to my right honourable friend the Prime Minister speak from the dispatch box, whether as Home Secretary or as Prime Minister, can be in no doubt about her commitment to the closest, most effective possible partnership now and in the future between police and law enforcement agencies in this country and those in other parts of the European Union. But what the amendment ignores is the very real negotiating challenge that the EU, which is the EU's position. They say that as a third country outside the Schengen area and without free movement, there would be restrictions on the UK's ability to participate in some EU tools and measures. And we do a disservice to the House if we do not recognise the reality of that negotiating challenge. Mr. Speaker, I believe that the deal that the government has negotiated provides the best way forward for this country to build its future relationship of friendship and deep partnership with the EU outside membership of the European Union. I believe that with the work that the Prime Minister, my right honourable friends, the Secretary of State and the Attorney General are undertaking to get the changes this House has asked for to the Northern Ireland backstop, that we can come back with a deal that the House should be willing, indeed eager, to endorse. That way, we will be able to deliver a result which both honours the outcome of the 2016 referendum, but does so in a way that protects jobs, prosperity and security of citizens in every part of the United Kingdom.
Order. The question is as on the order.